what about Keith now? Or, what about Keith now? My name is Matt Schuurman. I'm artistic director of a company called Rapid Fire Theatre from Edmonton, Canada. And I found out I was facilitating this session about 10 minutes ago. So very happy to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining us here. I'm going to take a little bit of time right now to introduce our panel speaking with us today. The topic, of course, What About Keith Now, will be focusing on the work of Keith Johnstone, as well as his teachings, and I suppose the relevance and importance of his work today. So let's go down the line and introduce each of our panelists. Take a second to say who you are, where you're from, and your experience with the work of Keith Johnstone.
Cool. Hello, I'm Patti Stiles. I was trained at the Loose Moose Theatre with Keith. And since then, oh gosh, I was at the Moose for about 7 years. And then I went to Toronto and I was the artistic director of Dream Kitchen Theatre there, which was another theatre sports company. And then I moved to Edmonton and I was the artistic director of Rapid Fire Theatre. And now I live in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm the co-artistic director of Impro Melbourne down there. And they're all theatre sports, Keith-based companies.
I'm Steve Jarand, and I also started at Loose Moose a number of decades ago. And I didn't have too much exposure to Keith, except most of the occasional class and directing and shows he did, until about 15 years ago when I started working on his mask technique. And then from there, we've made some more connections and even taught a little bit together.
I'm Joe Bill. I'm from Chicago. I've seen Loose Moose Theatre from the outside. Thanks to Patti Stiles, I got to have tea and scones with Keith for a few hours. I studied with Del Close in Chicago. I'm one of the founders of Annoyance Theatre. I currently do corporate stuff at IO Theatre. I have some title at Second City, which means I can call them up and teach a class there if I want to. And I learned of Keith at Second City, and I've been doing improv and impro for about 40 years. And for the last 8 or 9 years, I've known Patti Stiles, and so a while back, we decided that we would explore the proposition if someone who studied with Del and someone who studied with Keith improvised together, would we break improv or impro? And we have not done that.
We're still trying to.
We're still trying to.
Yeah.
And I suppose I should also tip a hat to, I think the one person that I either stand on the shoulders of or follow behind is Randy Dixon, who also studied with Del Close, but also with Keith, and he's a person that's very interested in fusing the schools together, and I'd say very much what I do is in that vein. So I value the work and the perspective.
I'm Dan O'Connor with a very hot mic.
Yes.
I'm the producing artistic director of Impro Theatre in Los Angeles, which used to be LA Theatre Sports. And I'm also founder of Bay Area Theatre Sports, or BATS Improv. And so I started working with Keith in 1986 when BATS was founded. We brought him down to tell us all the things we were doing wrong to San Francisco. And over the years, BATS and LATS and Rebecca Stockley, who was part of the founding of BATS, has brought Keith not only to BATS, we've brought him to LATS, but also to wonderful, weird, sustainable farm improv sessions in the middle of Northern California. So I've been working with Keith on and off since '86.
Awesome. Let's give it up for our panel today. Yeah. And I think it's also worth mentioning that, of course, the context of this session is within the overall context of an ITI conference, the licensing body for the works of, or the formats of Keith Johnstone. Just to kind of feel out the room and see who's here and who we're talking with today, and for the sake of those that may be listening to the podcast later, let's do a bit of an auditory sampling right now. If you make some noise, if you are currently involved in an organization that produces work of Keith Johnstone. Yeah. Fantastic. And make some noise if you've performed or been involved with any of his formats at all. Period. All right. And make some noise if you have no idea what's going on in front of you today. Perfect. All right. Well, we've got a few kind of prompt questions to get the ball rolling here, get the juices flowing. So I'm going to start off with that, and then after that, we can turn it over to you folks if you have any questions that you'd like to ask of the panel on the topic. So the first question I have for all four of you is, why do people have such a love-hate relationship with Keith's work?
I could start. I think sometimes people find Keith negative or authoritarian about improv. So people get the idea that anything's possible and it's about celebration, and then they either work with Keith or have heard of people that worked with Keith who say, "You're doing it wrong. You can't do it. You need to start here." And so I think they get discouraged because it becomes personal. And so I think that's partly a case of ego of like having a soft ego where you're fresh, you want to learn, and you don't want someone to say it's too hard or your way's going to get you on the wrong path. You want to just be loved. And so they put him aside. And then another part of it is, I think, the misrepresentation of Keith's work as Keith's work. And so it gets sort of snowballed there. Same way as all improv is the bad improv that you see. All improv is all bad improv is because of Keith Johnstone. and it's his biggest regret in this world is that people have misunderstood, and it's the misunderstood part that gets popularized. So those are a couple of things.
And I guess there are kind of two talking points here that we're looking at. And you touched on both of them. Both the work of Keith Johnstone as an improv guru, as an instructor, as a director, but also the formats that he has created. So both, I suppose, the love-hate relationship people may have with him and his personality, as you first spoke to, but then the formats themselves and perhaps the dilution or interpretation of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't say anything about love, but maybe you guys.
I love him.
Yeah.
I love him. I also think, following on that, when we were training at the Moose, it was very much a culture of honesty. So the notes were very honest and straightforward. There was a lot of working on removing the ego from the work to actually get to the technical points of the work. So every show we did notes. The notes were pretty direct. And you learn that, notes are someone's opinion. Take what's useful, dump the rest. But if you hear a note 2 or 3 times in a row, you should pay attention. And that language we all developed as a company of that. We don't have to pat each other on the back for all the great things we've done. It was really, I want to learn. I want to learn. So the compliments were nice, but really felt like candy floss. You were seeking out someone to give you something that you could chew on and challenge and grow with. And that was just our speak. That was our way of speaking. Then we started going to festivals. And someone would come up and say, "What'd you think of the show?" And we thought, you must, because you do Keith's work, have this same culture of let's just be really honest and open and direct, knowing that a note is just a note, and I only know what I know, so if it's not useful, that's fine. And we started getting into a lot of trouble because it wasn't necessarily the culture that followed with the work in other places, which is fine. Every company has their own language and their own way of being. So it was our lack of awareness of the global community and going out and speaking as we did. And I think we started a chain of following on a little bit of that negative response, which I don't think has served the reputation of Keith well. I think if you're a loose mooser, it was like, you're going to be a bit arrogant, or you're going to be a bit blunt, or you're going to be a bit direct, or you're going to be a bit negative. Where actually what we want to be is helpful and have a conversation as artists in a shared space that we all know we can be good or not at any moment, and that's fine. So I think that added to it.
We were in a bit of a vacuum because there were many more years having been established at Loose Moose in this tradition that before others were cutting their teeth and getting experience for years in their companies. And so we weren't initially in part of the sharing to see how those cultures worked. And we probably thought, well, at least in time, we've been doing it longer. And, you know, for better or for worse, that came along, and probably some of the attitude.
Yeah. I also think it's easy to, when someone's put on a pedestal, they're also easy to throw rocks at. And, you know, with Spolin and Close and Johnstone, Keith's the one that remains. So I think there's a little bit of easy target there as well.
And by that you mean he's alive.
Yeah. Yes, sorry, yes.
Not
you know,
he is remains. Yeah.
No. So I think if any of the other teachers were still alive, there might be a little bit more conversation, but they've gone into martyr status in a way. You know, you don't speak ill of the dead kind of thing. It's a different, no?
I think that's true, and I think that,
You can totally speak ill of the dead.
yes, for sure. Especially Dell, he would like that. But, you know, there's something to there's a saying, the prophets do the good work and the disciples screw everything up. And so those of us that have studied, were firsthand studiers of Keith or Dell or Spolin or Boal or whoever, when we go out, and it's the same thing with Dell, when we go out and we teach Harold, we're going to teach stuff that's Dell. We're teaching Dell, but really we're teaching our version of that.
Yes.
And so if we give too much weight to I'm doing the work of this other, then we remove ourselves from the ownership of what our piece of it is. And I think that's a contributor to the negativity. So, and it's difficult. Teaching is very difficult. Coaching is very difficult. Giving feedback is very difficult. And it's a process for us also as teachers, coaches, directors to own our own voice and not just attribute it to the dead or alive of the quote-unquote prophet that we studied under.
I think that when I've talked to people who have an issue with Keith, it's usually people who have an issue with somebody who is teaching Keith badly.
Yeah.
It's not Keith. And Keith is the first person to say he's not a guru. And yet there are people who have taken ownership of, as the further away from Calgary you get as far as the formats go, and I think we should point out that 3 of us on this panel have been or are members of the ITI, which is trying to honor and protect the longevity of Keith's formats and more importantly, the Keithiness of Keith.
Can we get
That's
that?
the official byline of the ITI.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about that. You know, where can we put Keithiness in? But I think, you know, the further you get away, I know I've been shocked when I've been exposed to somebody who has taken theater sports and made it into a theatricalized version of martial law. that it's really weird because there are people who are uptight and upset about that, and they blame Keith as opposed to whatever the organization is that is doing it. And you know, we've had our problems in Los Angeles, but we named our theater company Impro Theater because we all came from a Keith background and were inspired by the work of Keith. At the same time, we also had moosers and other people coming down and going, "You're doing it wrong," without understanding that we're in a completely different demographic, terrarium, cultural world than Calgary. You know, Los Angeles has 500 improv groups, and at the time, I can't remember if there was anybody else aside from the Moose in the early 90s, what have you. So I think there's been friction because people are passionate about Keith, and rightly so, but how that is delivered and how that is manifest is different.
Joe, you used the word disciples, and I think that's somewhat apt. There's these people that have trained with Keith, perhaps at the Moose, and have gone all over the globe and continued on the work in very much a discipleship, and carried that flag or carried that banner in other cities. And Dan, you also mentioned that people, if people have an issue with the form, it's because people are doing it poorly. So that leads me to my next question. Can you alter the formats and still be playing the formats?
It's fun. I think Patti and I have talked about this before, but I feel like the format, if this is a really weird judgment call, but if you're really embracing Keith, that you can let that ripple become whatever it is that your culture kind of would progress to. It's a very inarticulate sentence, but the idea that in doing theater sports in a traditional Keith way and finding things as you grow, as it evolves, that might be important to your particular group, I think is really important. And I think that still is an issue where people are like, no, because they're pointing out things that they like or they don't like. I know over the years, the entire issue of the bag or the horn has become, a knife fight in the alley afterwards. and you're kind of going, guys, it's theater. I think personally that it can grow if the seeds are right. However, as I mentioned before, I think there are places where you go and go, this is not that.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's elements of the show or elements of the formats that are in place, excuse me, that allow for a spirit of Keith's work to exist in the work. So the horn is there to support risk and to protect the improvisers. If you understand the concept of the horn and its place within how we can allow improvisers to take bigger risks because someone is supporting them if that risk doesn't play out, you've got someone who can help get you off stage, then it makes sense. Where I think sometimes people don't understand why the horn, because they don't understand a little bit more about the technique of Keith, so they start removing elements because they don't understand the elements. So then it's not a cultural choice, it's I don't understand how this works, delete. And where they are in their growth as a company, those elements could actually help them train and move forward as improvisers, and then maybe they could ask that question. Keith wants growth, he wants challenge, he wants things to evolve. But when we take away the elements that actually support the work to allow it to evolve, we're actually doing it the opposite way around. So I would say there's elements of the format that are useful to release or provide an environment for the work to grow. And those elements are really important in the format. When you get to a certain point that maybe you're playing and you don't need that support, then you can look at the cultural elements, but use that so that you can grow as an improviser first.
Can I just add, as someone who learned this later from the best teachers in the world, getting to play with them, like Patti, like Jacob Bannigan, like Mark Meir, like Derek Flores, that I look at it as there's three parts. There's the structure, there's the content, and there's a spirit.
Yeah.
And so I think teachers in any approach to improv, they kind of have their favorite thing to focus on, and you have to balance all three. And the reason that I feel fortunate is the people I got to learn with and experience with could speak all three things to me at the same time without knowing that's what I needed. It's just that I had experience and I could engage on a structural level. I could gauge on a content level. Why are judges? What's with the judges? I could see Flores when I did a maestro with him Australia and just see the spirit that he makes. Like, oh, that's the guy from my world, but it's the same spirit. And so not having gone to classes to getting to learn on the job, as an outsider, like as I hear you talking about these different elements, can you alter the structure? Can you alter the format? I wonder to what degree you have to talk about all three if that's going to happen.
Right. And once again, those three are content,
Structure, content, spirit.
Great.
There's the same problem. I think I'm yes-anding something Patti said, but there's the same problem that improvisers have, which is that they yes-and, but they don't because. You know what I'm saying? That there's a literalness to learning Keith's work, and people get very anal about it, but they don't ask themselves why. Why is there a horn? Why is there a bag? Why are we doing this? And so it really comes down to doing the work, because I think you really have to do the hard work of learning how to do theater sports or maestro or gorilla properly, so that you can tear it down and do what you want with it or have fun with it in your own way. But that I don't know, especially now, whether people have the patience to actually put in the work, because people, I think improv to a certain extent is a pejorative in a lot of ways, because there's so much bad improv. We used to say back in the day, all improv is good improv because it brings attention to improvisation. But I think maybe the tipping point has happened, and now
peak bad improv.
We got critical mass in certain places. So where you're going, God, there's so much bad improv because it's such a user-friendly thing that anybody can improvise, and a lot of people who shouldn't be improvising yet are improvising. So I think there's a thing of just not being willing to do the work to establish a good foundation, platform, whatever you want to call it, of doing the work and then learning from there and evolving as you evolve. But I do think it is possible to evolve Keith's work. And I think that every group is going to have something different as long as it's not calcified or constipated.
Yeah. Cool. If I could just, pick up on what Joe said. Content, spirit, structure. We're talking about changing structure. If you change the structure and it impacts the spirit and the content, then those changes in the structure aren't helpful. Because it's the spirit of Keith's work and the content that he's hoping to release in the work that are important components of his work. So if you change the structure and it doesn't allow for that, the structure, that change isn't useful. If you've got the spirit and the content and you change the structure, but you've still got the spirit and the content, the structure is a device to allow you to do the spirit and the content. So if that's in place, it doesn't matter if you do the free improv. It doesn't matter if you use judges for both matches. It doesn't matter if you have one judge. If you've still got the spirit and the content in place, which comes back to doing the work. But most people change the structure because they haven't done the work. They don't understand the spirit and content, so they remove things in the structure that are there to help you learn the spirit and the content, and then it's not Keith's work, but it's got his name on it, and it goes roundabout.
Yeah, I like that. The structure as a lens through which all of it is.
The structure was it's there to support.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. We're running a little bit low on time. Sorry, Steve, if you had something
I
to.
just have a quick thing. I think you can be sensitive to culture as well. I was just talking to a Japanese improviser who was here, and he's talking about the issue with judges in Japan and being able to, what your relationship to authority is in different places. And they said that as even people who understand what the judges are for, their roles, immediately they start dressing up the judges and making them ridiculous so that the people in the crowd can boo them. They hear booing the judges is important. They even may understand it, but no one's going to boo a real authority figure in Japan. But here we love that.
Yeah.
We love that chance, and it's in our sports culture and everything else.
Right. So it's figuring out the spirit and the content. The structure is altered to allow the spirit and the content instead of changing the structure, which doesn't allow the spirit and the content.
Love that. We got a few minutes here. If there's any thoughts or questions from you in the audience, I'll come and bring you the mic. Yes.
Yeah.
Just to put a last pin on this. One of the things I know that or I have observed being changed in groups, one of the things that often gets cut is the horn. We've mentioned the horn, but specifically the horn for boring.
Yes.
And so there's the possibility of an insult wrapped up in that name, right? And so if you're in a culture that values show business, if you're in a place where if you're performing and you're worried about who's watching, right? I need to get an agent, I need to book a gig. That's very different than in our little theater out by the airport at Loose Moose, where we're doing the work for the sake of the work. If there's a showcase element, and then suddenly there's this thing called the horn for boring, now I'm in a real panic that I'm going to get called boring, right? So if you're coming at it, if the ego is involved in that sense, or you don't understand that, then you go, oh, well, we want to support all our players. We don't want to tell anyone that they're boring, certainly not publicly, so that they now don't have an agent or they've missed out on a gig because publicly they were told they were boring. I think that gets added onto it, so we go, let's take that away, we'll call it something else, the pink shoe of salvation. I don't know if that still exists somewhere in the world, but I know it's a thing, or it was a thing.
I think it still is a thing.
So I think there's that sort of, again, it's the lack of, it's not understanding the reason that it's there. And that horn for boring, we are all terrified to be told we're boring.
Yeah, and if you just call it, like in situations like that, where you do have those elements at play, because in some places in the world, there could be agents in the audience. So move for boring. The horn is still there. It's still getting you off stage when you are boring, because do you really want to be on stage dying even more in front of that agent? So it's actually working to help you, because if you get the horn and you respond to it and you're playing the sport element theatrically, you can actually show more diversity in your freedom and your skill on stage, acting in the scene and acting in the format. Right? But if you just need to remove for boring to give permission to explore the horn and learn how to accept it, there may be a possibility there. Right?
Just to say that in Los Angeles, where we have plenty of agents, we have never not had the horn. We've always had the horn.
Yeah.
Nicely done.
Yes. And I would also just add, to become an older improviser who is going to feel confident anytime, you have to embrace that you can be boring.
Yes.
If you're in resistance to the idea that you can't be boring, you will continue to be boring. Being a professional means it could go boring at any second.
Right.
Yeah. If you're in denial, you already are.
That's right.
Yeah.
Love that. Any other thoughts from our audience here before we wrap it up? Yes, Neil.
I was interested in the role of the director. A lot of the time, people sort of backlash against that in a maestro or a gorilla. They feel like directing is like a training tool that I use for class instead of a thing that I would want to have for me when I'm performing. And so I'm curious about kind of how you might deal with that backlash in a company or on stage if you're directing a maestro or directing in a gorilla.
I have a limited sample, sir, of maestro directing. But I think that there's too much directing in maestro, unless it's a bunch of complete amateurs. To me, also, we side coach like nobody's business in rehearsal. We stop things, we side coach a lot. We try and get our students to understand you are going to be stopped, you are going to be directed, but it is to yes and because whatever the challenge is there. It may be even to point out something good they're doing. But I feel like, and this goes back to how the formats, the further away they get from Keith, because I've experienced maestros where I'm like, let them play.
Yeah.
And it drives me nuts because it becomes the director's show, and the improvisers don't get to play, and it drives me crazy. And I've seen, and I've been in countries where it has obviously gotten away, and it's gotten to a point where it's become this other thing. I do think, having watched Keith and and I've directed Maestro with Keith, and I think that the way Keith directs, the way Dennis directs, to me, and other people who have done it, is just enough. You're there to help the improviser just enough. You're a safety rail, don't step on that. But I've also seen it, like theater sports, become very much regimented, and I think non-Keith.
Yeah. The director's role is to help inspire the performers, to give you permission to move the scene forward when maybe you want to step back. When the fear of the improviser starts to rise up and they want to whimper or avoid, the director goes, go forward. Without telling the future, trying to prod you to discover it. And it's a skill that has to be learned. It is not the director's show. Keith is constantly fighting with trying to get content on stage that's worthwhile. And so theater sports opens the door for people to challenge to whatever they want to do and create the scenes that they want to create. And often it tends to be light entertainment. So then we get maestro, so it's okay. If we're on stage in front of an audience, so we make these choices of light entertainment because people are watching us, what if someone off stage is giving us scene setups? Maybe then we can get into the scenes about content. But then the directors off stage start coming in trying to make it light entertainment. So they come in with light entertainment ideas because the directors want to be loved by the audience. So then we move to guerrilla, which is, okay, what if we punish each other when you don't do a good job of directing? It's still the quest for content, and it shouldn't be the director's show. Our job is to inspire each other. Yeah?
All right, we are running short on time, but one more thought. Yeah, Rebecca.
I taught a director's workshop for Maestro once, and it took me a little. I was about like a third of the way in before I realized, because like you, Dan, I was like, what is going on here? There's too much. And what I realized in discussion with this small group of baby Maestro directors was that they were watching the scenes thinking, if I was an improviser in that scene right now, what would I say or do right now? And so you would get direction like, say this funny line, do this thing, right? They're inside the scene as opposed to sitting outside like a teacher. And Keith said this to me at one point, and I thought this was so great, and it actually makes me shut up when I think this. He said, watch the scene and look for what is latent in the scene, what is subconscious, what is a promise that the improvisers have made that they have not yet fulfilled. And if you're looking for those things, you don't say very much.
No.
And when you're looking, like Patti says, you're looking for, they're refusing to go into the future. I see someone afraid there. Or this happened in Maestro last night. Someone asked one of the players asked for a suggestion. It clearly didn't light them up.
Yeah.
As a director, we said, that didn't inspire you. Don't take that suggestion. That's it.
Yeah. So if in a scene someone says, I have a confession to make, and the other person goes, yes, and they go, would you like a cup of tea first? The director can say, confess. Right? Because obviously the offer of, would you like a cup of tea first, is, I've now made this offer, and I don't know where to go with that offer. And then if they don't know what to confess, you can say, the other day, you can give them the start. And then if they won't take it, help them. Right? So it's baby steps to help inspire the moment. It's not, let me tell you the scene that you're now going to enact that I've envisioned, which is my great idea, because I'm the improviser on the outside. It's a skill to learn.
And it comes from a response from where the content used to be coming, or often, which was audience suggestions, and still is. And so I think even if we're not doing these directing formats well, or as well as we could, and we're maturing to them, at least it's a balance for all of the other formats that are getting a lot of their content from people trying to be funny out there.
And
Awesome.
Thank
you.
And if you don't like being directed in a format, if Maestro's not your thing, cool.
Yeah.
Like
Period.
it's okay to have what you like and what you don't like. There's a lot of formats, and I would just say if you don't like Maestro, write out a list of why, create a format based on that.
That's great. Yeah, love that. All right, we are officially over on time, which means I have failed my duties as facilitator.
Yay!
I do want to thank our panel for speaking and for all of you attending here in the Courtyard Playhouse. And thank you for your questions, and encourage you to have this conversation and continue the conversation elsewhere throughout the week. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
guys.
Yay.